Welcome to Sinister Radio. We're diving into the unknown, where the ordinary twists into the eerie, and the shadows hold stories few dare to tell. We'll be taking you to the edge of reality, where shadows blur and fear takes shape. Have you ever felt that chill on the back of your neck, as though someone or something is watching? Don't worry, you're not alone. We invite you to step into a world of unsettling and spine-tingling stories that will make you question what you know and what might be lurking in the dark. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the darkness in. Tonight, we invite you to join us on a sinister journey, a path through 3 chilling tales of horror that will twist your mind, quicken your pulse, and haunt your dreams. The story I'm about to share will make you question the innocence of a smile. Once you've heard it, you might start seeing him too. Are you ready to hear about a smile you'll never forget? Let's begin. When 8-year-old Tommy saw the Happy Man for the first time, it was on a rainy and cold night. While he lay tucked into his bed, a man-shaped figure was standing in his room. Behind the door, he was tall, dressed in some kind of dark suit, and had a big smile that stretched from ear to ear, impossibly wide, filled with too many teeth. The Happy Man's eyes never blinked once. He just stood there, smiling and looking at Tommy. In a split second, the Happy Man stood by his side at his bed. As Tommy was about to scream, the man in Tommy's room raised his long, bony finger to Tommy's lips as he was saying, "Shish, don't be scared." He smiled from ear to ear, leaned in and whispered, "I'm your friend." Suddenly Tommy wasn't scared anymore. He wanted a friend for so long after he and his parents moved into the new house in a new city. Late at night, Happy Man would visit Tommy, wake him up and tell him bedtime stories, tales of dark forests, silent lakes, and secret places where only special friends could go. Tommy loved the stories Happy Man whispered. When he was with Happy Man, he wasn't tired, didn't need sleep. Tommy felt so happy, he now had someone he could call his friend. A friend who would never lie to him, never upset him, only make him feel happy. One night, after telling Tommy a story about the silence in the forest at night, with his big happy smile, Happy Man said, "Let's play hide and seek. You hide, I seek. But remember, don't make any noise. If your parents hear us, they're gonna ruin our happy time, and you don't want that." Tommy smiled and shook his head. Tommy's parents started to notice his face was getting paler and paler. His eyes had dark shadows beneath them. His small body was growing weaker, as if something was slowly draining the life out of him. They asked him if he was feeling sick, but Tommy just smiled. A big smile. He didn't want to tell them about the Happy Man, his special friend with the big smile, who came each night to tell him bedtime stories and play hide and seek. Night after night, the Happy Man appeared, always waiting in the corner of Tommy's room, smiling. Sometimes before Tommy woke up, he moved closer, bending down until his face was few inches from Tommy's. One night, Tommy's mom peeked into his room. She saw the shadow of a man standing near Tommy's bed. He was looking at Tommy while smiling. He looked right at her with his empty eyes and big smile. Tommy's mom screamed and turned on the lights, but there was no one there, no man or no trace of him. She looked at Tommy, who was laying in his bed with his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling and with a smile on his face. His mom ran towards him and called, "Tommy, Tommy, did something happen to you?" Tommy's mom held him in her arms and started to sing a lullaby he loved when he was a baby. His eyes began to blink again, then slowly closing, and fell asleep. Tommy's mom told his dad about the smiling man in Tommy's room, and they decided to take turns staying with him for the night. When Tommy's parents were asleep next to him, he would lay awake waiting for Happy Man to visit again. One evening, when Tommy's dad fell asleep beside him, Tommy sat up in bed and turned toward the corner of the room. And there he was, The happy man. He was waiting. His smile was wider than ever. The happy man whispered, "Do you want to be my friend forever, Tommy? Then take my hand." His long fingers reached out. Tommy always felt happy when he was with his friend, so he didn't hesitate. He reached out his own small hand, allowing the cold, sharp fingers to close around his. As soon as their hands touched, the happy man's smile twisted and stretching until it was an empty void, an abyss of darkness. His eyes gleamed with a terrible hunger as he pulled Tommy closer. The boy's body grew limp, his eyes vacant. In that moment, Tommy's father woke up. He looked around the room, and there was Tommy standing in the darkness. Tommy's eyes were wide open, his face frozen in a smile that mimicked the happy man's. Too big and too vacant smile. His dad tried to shake him, to wake him, but Tommy wouldn't move. He just sat there, staring at him with an unblinking gaze, his smile stretching impossibly wide. The room grew colder and colder as his dad got the feeling of a shadow creep over them. Something dark and sinister that had come to stay. And Tommy, or what was left of him, never spoke again, only smiling that big, empty smile. As if he had finally found his happy place in the shadows, with his special friend forever. And that was tonight's first story. That was chilling, wasn't it? Take a moment to catch your breath, because it's time for some music to let those goosebumps settle. While you relax with some music, we'll get the next tale ready for you. Good evening, thrill seekers. You are listening to Sinister Radio. Hope you enjoyed the first story about the happy man. Now it's time for the second story of tonight's journey. I will tell a story that invites you into the depths of fear. It's a story that'll make you double check the darkness tonight. Take a look around, keep your doors locked, and watch your back. Because who knows what might be lurking in the shadows after turning off the lights. Are you ready to face the fear? Let's begin. Samantha had always found comfort in the isolation of her home. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the hustle and noise of the city. She and her husband, Mark, had moved there for the peace, the solitude and the beauty of the forest that surrounded their dream house. Mark was away on a business trip, scheduled to be gone for the next few days. Samantha had been dreading the nights alone, not because of the house or the distance from town, but because of her sleep paralysis. She had suffered from it for years, a condition that left her trapped between waking and sleeping, her body frozen while her mind danced on the edge of nightmares. Usually, Mark was there to comfort her, to be there by her side, if he heard her muffled whimpers in the night. But tonight, there would be no one to comfort her and be with her if she gets another seizure. As Samantha was cleaning the kitchen table, she felt like something or someone was watching her. She tried to shake off the creeping unease she felt by the thought. Then Samantha heard a creaking sound. She looked at the kitchen window close to the stairs that led down to the basement. She told herself it was just the wind rattling the windows and the old house creaking. An hour later, Samantha finally decided to head to bed. So she turned off the lights and the whole house was now filled with darkness. She curled up under the blankets, pulling them tight around her as she closed her eyes, willing sleep to come swiftly and peacefully. Hours passed, and in the dead of night, she drifted into a restless slumber. She was in that strange, hazy state between dreams and reality when it happened. Her eyes snapped open, but her body would not move. She tried to shift, to blink, but she was paralyzed, locked in place by the invisible weight that pinned her to the bed. Her room was drenched in shadows, illuminated only by the faint, bluish light of the moon filtering through the window. She could see the room, feel the covers, even hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, but she was unable to move. Her body heavy and unresponsive. Then, she sensed it, a presence. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, stood a figure. At first, it was only a dark shape, something her mind struggled to define. But slowly, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out more details. It was a figure of a man, tall, with unnaturally long arms that hung down by his sides. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching her with an intent curiosity. Though she couldn't see his face clearly, she felt his gaze on her, cold and unblinking. Samantha's eyes were wide and desperately looking around the room. Her heart thundered in her chest, and she tried to scream. But her mouth refused to open. She was trapped, helpless, forced to lie there as the figure moved closer. She could hear the soft, shuffling footsteps as he approached the side of her bed, each step agonizingly slow. The room felt colder, the air heavy and thick with a sense of dread that pressed down on her like a weight. The figure leaned over her. Its face was few inches from hers. She could finally see its eyes, dark and hollow, as if they were endless pits that led into nothingness. His breath was cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her skin. He reached out one long, skeletal hand and placed it on her forehead. His touch felt icy and unnerving. She felt him rooting himself into her mind, a parasite that fed off her fear. In that moment, she could feel his thoughts, a wave of evil intent that washed over her, suffocating her. He wanted to stay, to nest in her mind, to feed off her helplessness and fear. She struggled with all her might, straining against the paralysis that bound her, desperate to break free. Then, suddenly without warning, she could move her arms, her upper body. The room was empty, and the figure was gone. Her body was slick with sweat, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She looked around, searching the shadows for any sign of the intruder. But there was no one. The room was silent, the house still, as if nothing had happened. Shakenly, she stumbled out of bed, flicking on every light in the room, desperately hoping to chase away the lingering shadows and get back to reality. She paced the room, running her hands through her hair. Samantha felt like she was losing her mind. It had felt so real. She could still feel the chill of his touch, the weight of his presence. After a while, she convinced herself it was just another episode of sleep paralysis, a particularly vivid and horrifying hallucination. She climbed back into her bed, leaving the lights on this time. She closed her eyes, hoping for the dawn to come quickly. But as she laid in her bed, she thought of Mark, and how much she missed and needed him. She wanted to text him, so she looked at the nightstand, but it wasn't there. She always kept her phone there when going to bed, but now it was gone. She sat up, looked around the room. She thought to herself, maybe I left it downstairs? No, she was absolutely sure. She put her phone on the nightstand before turning off the lights. Then she heard the sound of the floorboards creaking outside her bedroom. Her head turned towards the sound. When she saw that her door was slightly open, she froze. Her breathing became heavier, her heartbeat racing as she felt uneasy. As she was looking at the door slowly opened. Samantha knew in that moment she wasn't alone. An unfamiliar man was standing in the doorway. He looked at her with a hungry, evil gaze. He had been waiting just on the other side of the slightly open door, lurking in the dark, silently watching her laying helpless in her bed, not able to move. Samantha screamed as the man slowly, methodically, crept closer, with his hands in front of him, ready to grab her. How's everyone doing out there? Spooked yet? Don't worry, we'll give you a little break with some tunes before we dive into our next and last story. Hang tight, it's only going to get scarier from here. Welcome back, dear listeners. Now it's time for tonight's last story. A story that invites you on a journey down a long, dark road. Imagine you are stranded in the dark and kindness from a stranger is your only hope out of the darkness. A light in the distance, maybe what you've been praying for. But what if the stranger who welcomes you has been waiting for you all along? I suggest you listen closely, because sometimes the help you seek is the most dangerous of all. The story I am about to tell you is about a man whose night is about to take a dark turn. Before the night is over, he'll probably wish he'd stayed on that dark road. Let's begin. Evan hadn't seen his father in nearly 15 years. A few weeks earlier, a letter had arrived in the mail, scrawled in his father's handwriting. It was vague, asking him to come visit him in the small town Evan barely remembered from his childhood. Evan's dad wanted to leave the past behind and be a part of his life again. After a long day's drive, Evan was on the final stretch. For miles the gas gauge had been blinking because the need of fuel, but he hadn't seen a gas station in hours. The engine finally gave out, and Evan stopped the car right on the desolate road, surrounded by miles of dense forest. He cursed under his breath as he pulled out his phone. No signal. The darkness pressed in around him, swallowing the empty road, as he looked down both directions, hoping for headlights. There was only silence, broken by the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the woods. With no other options, he turned on the flashlight on his phone and began to walk. He had passed a turnoff a while back, and he figured it must lead to some kind of homestead. After about 20 minutes, he saw it, a sprawling, dilapidated farm. The glow of a single, flickering porch light illuminating the worn exterior. He approached the farmhouse. He could see the outline of a barn in the distance. Beyond the barn, there were other smaller structures and some rusty farming equipment half buried in overgrown weeds. His flashlight from his phone cut through the darkness, landing on a large stain on the ground near the front porch. The stain was dark and viscous, trailing off into the tall grass. As though something had been dragged toward the barn. Evan's gut twisted, but he needed help. He decided to check the house first and found the front door slightly open. Evan knocked on the door. "Hello, is anyone home? My car broke down and I need help." Silence greeted him, and the house remained dark. It creaked as he pushed it, revealing a dark hallway. He stepped inside, scanning the walls with his flashlight. The place was eerily silent, the air thick and the oppressive silence seemed to weigh on him. But it was the door to the basement that drew him, slightly ajar and leading into a pitch-black void. As Evan stood at the top of the stairs, behind the slightly open door, a faint sound reached his ears, a low, muffled moan, almost like someone struggling to breathe. In that moment the light was turned on and a man was standing in the kitchen with him pointing a gun at him. The man's face etched with irritation and demanded, "What are you doing in my house at this hour?" Evan replied, his voice trembling with fear, "I am sorry. I didn't mean to just enter your house. My car broke down, and I need help." The man in front of him lowered his weapon, and the aggressive expression on his face shifted into a smile, one that sent a chill through Evan, leaving him deeply unsettled. "I am Ben, nice to meet you. You can sleep here for the night, and you can call for help in the morning?" Although the thought of having to sleep there made him uneasy, he didn't know what else to do. Ben now noticed the door to the basement was slightly ajar. He looked at Evan with a strange smile and then walked past him to close the door beside him. As Evan was laying sleepless in the guest room with his eyes wide open, he couldn't stop thinking about the sounds he heard coming from the basement, the way the man looked at him, and most of all, the stains outside, as though something had been dragged toward the barn. He couldn't stay here. Evan grabbed his phone and quietly walked out the door to the hallway. As he walked past the kitchen, he looked at the door to the basement. He hesitated, his heart was racing, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He opened the door slowly and descended the stairs, his flashlight illuminating a small, cramped basement cluttered with piles of old tools and crates. Then he saw it, a figure tied to a chair in the corner. Their heads slumped forward, their body covered in bruises and cuts. Evan's blood ran cold as he realized it was a man, barely alive. His breath shallow and ragged. The man's eyes fluttered open, and he let out a weak, rasping sound, his mouth trying to form words. But before Evan could approach, a sound echoed through the basement, the creak of the floorboards above. Evan froze. The man upstairs was awake. He turned off his flashlight, standing perfectly still as the footsteps moved slowly across the floor above. Panic seized him by the thought of getting caught by the man upstairs. What if he came down to the basement? He moved back toward the stairs, hoping to get out of the house before he got caught. But as he did, he heard another sound, a low, gurgling noise coming from behind him. Evan turned, aiming the flashlight back at the man in the chair. And for a moment, he could swear he saw the man's mouth stretching into a grotesque smile, his eyes wide with a strange, twisted glee. A sudden loud crash from upstairs jolted him back to the present. He scrambled up the stairs, his footfalls barely masked by the sound of heavy boots thundering through the house. He pushed open the basement door, emerging into the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. But as he crossed the threshold, he stopped for a moment. The barn doors outside were now wide open, revealing a cage containing something or someone that writhed and shuddered in the dim moonlight. Evan squinted, trying to make out what he was seeing. His stomach lurched as he realized the cage held a person, twisted and contorted, the person's face gaunt and hollow, eyes staring out at him with a pleading desperation that made him stop breathing for a second. The sound of footsteps behind him yanked him from his horror-struck trance. He turned and saw a tall figure standing in the doorway. The man's face was shadowed, but Evan could see the glint of a blade in his hand. It was Ben. He was grinning, his teeth bared like an animal, his eyes gleaming with a sinister delight. Evan took a step back, but the man in front of him advanced, raising the blade. He stumbled, and the man grabbed him. Evan fought, desperate to break free, but he was stronger. His face was now inches from Evan's. The man leaned in and whispered, "You should have stayed in your room, waited until it was your turn." Evan's screams echoed through the night, reverberating off the dense forest that encircled the farm, yet no one was there to hear them. By the time dawn arrived, the farm was silent once again. The barn doors shut tight and the evilness hidden in the shadows. Only the flickering porch light remained, a silent witness to the horrors that lay within. And somewhere in the depths of the farmhouse, a new figure was tied to a chair, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon that cursed place. Thank you for listening tonight. Our time together in the dark has come to an end. But remember, even as we end tonight's story, countless others are lurking in the shadows, waiting to be told. So join us again, if you dare, when we return with more stories to haunt your nights. Until then, sleep tight and sweet dreams. And try not to let the darkness creep in. We'll be waiting for you till next time, right here on Sinister Radio.